Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. Happy New Year. I haven't been here in the last 5 weeks, but I am so happy to ring in 2025 with an incredible guest. I have oodles and oodles and oodles to get to with Deborah Treisman today on the show. Deborah is the fiction editor for The New Yorker, and I just can't wait to have this conversation. But first, a little bit of introduction. We are live streaming, as always, on A Mighty Blaze, on Facebook, and on YouTube. The Thoughtful Bro is here every week to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. And A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative that connects writers and readers virtually. At A Mighty Blaze, we're never asking for money. If you want to show the love, you can just retweet us, repost us, follow us, tell your friends about us, all the things. And if you are in the mood to spend money, I have an idea for you. You can spend it on books that gather up some of the finest fiction of the last century, edited by one of the most gifted and influential editors around, Deborah Treisman. Books like A Century of Fiction in The New Yorker. We will put links to buy that in the chat. So go ahead, buy one for yourself, one of your favorite fiction-loving friends. You will not regret it. If you want to ask a question to Deborah, a lot of questions have actually already come in, but we're going to spend, we'll save about 5 minutes or so at the end of the interview to get to your questions. Just please post them in the chat and they will make their way to us. And now, on to this week's guest. Deborah Treisman has been the fiction editor of The New Yorker for over 20 years. At the age of 32, she was the youngest person to become the magazine's fiction editor and only the second woman to do so. She's edited a who's who of global fiction writers today, including Salman Rushdie, George Saunders, DeLillo, Jennifer Egan, Zadie Smith, Murakami, and scores more. Treisman also hosts the popular New Yorker fiction podcast, where authors read and discuss their favorite New Yorker stories written by other people. And she also hosts the Writer's Voice podcast, where their authors talk about their own fiction, which has appeared in The New Yorker. She's on the show today, as I mentioned, to discuss the new anthology that she has edited, A Century of Fiction in The New Yorker. Deborah Treisman, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you for having me.
So, as I said, I'm so excited. But first, I was trying to explain to like a literary civilian what it means to have you on the show. And so I said, look, The New Yorker is sort of like Saturday Night Live. It's like once a week, and there's some one story gets published each week and one author is in the spotlight. And so I think the analogy that works for me is that Deborah Treisman is the Lorne Michaels of American fiction. Does that work for you?
I guess. Okay. Yeah, I'll go with that.
I think it works. I love it. But so folks, here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about Deborah's philosophy as an editor. We're going to talk about the writers she works with and how she works with writers. And then we're going to get to that big mysterious thing that like every writer in America thinks about, which is how things work deep inside The New Yorker. We're going to try to kind of peel back the layers and figure out how a piece of fiction makes it from some author's desk all the way onto the pages of The New Yorker. And then, as I said, we'll take some audience questions. But Deborah, let's just start out and just introduce people to what this book is. So The New Yorker was founded in 1925. It was like a humor magazine back then. There was kind of some punchy, light fiction in it, but it obviously has grown in stature over the years. You reviewed 13,000 or so, or there have been 13,000 pieces of fiction in The New Yorker, and you winnowed it down somehow to like 78 stories. How did that work?
I actually have no idea because basically it was very hard for me to do my regular job. So if you sent me a story sometime last year, this is why I have not answered. I don't know. I started with just ideas of stories from my time here, which is 27 years. So a quarter of a century, thinking about which stories, I couldn't forget. And I tried to find some kind of compromise between having stories, of course, by the writers who were kind of defining for the magazine. And it's not just the Cheevers and Updikes, but also Barthelme and Borges and other writers whom people don't realize were frequently published in the magazine in their time. So a compromise between feeling there were certain writers who had to be included and feeling that what I wanted to put out was a book of stories rather than a book of writers. and especially when it comes to recent years, because there are 50 other writers that I've worked with or, published while I've been here that I would have loved to include. And there was no way to include everyone. So then I had to focus in on stories that just hit a nerve or hit one of my nerves, I guess.
I would imagine it was sort of like planning a wedding. There's sort of like the last person out. You're always like, oh, if I just want to invite that one last person, but you got to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah. And I had probably a long list of about 125 that I cut down to 78. Mm-hmm. And those cuts were really, really hard.
Mm. Yeah. There are some super famous landmark stories in this collection. Just to name a few: Perfect Day for Banana Fish by Zadie Smith, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, Brokeback Mountain, Cat Person, one of the most viral short stories of all time, is in here. I guess what I would ask to you is, like, now I know you have to be diplomatic, that's part of your job, but maybe we can just choose from, like, among authors who have passed away, but, like, is there one or two that are like your all-time faves that are in this collection?
Yeah, maybe I should only choose among dead writers.
To be diplomatic, let's go.
I'm the obvious ones, the ones that are in many anthologies that you read in school, like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. I wouldn't bother singling out. There's a story by let me see if I can find when it appeared, by John Berger. Came out in 2002, called The Courtesy. And that's probably one that just has stayed with me. It's basically about a man wandering around Portugal and having frequent encounters with his dead mother. And it's so moving and so funny and strange. So that's definitely one that, wasn't an automatic inclusion, but was for me. Mm-hmm. There is, there's just so many. Yeah. A Mavis Gallant story called Voices Lost in Snow. And Mavis was someone I was reading, in college, and whose work meant a lot to me in a formative time. Yeah. And so it was important to me to have her in the anthology, and important for the magazine.
Yeah, I mean, looking through this thing, it's sort of like listening to kind of like a best of the Beatles. It's like, it's almost overwhelming. Like, you sort of, like, in an album, you need some duds, so you can kind of tune out and then appreciate the good ones. But in a collection like this, it's just like, oh my God, there's that story. Oh my God, there's that one. And it's sort of overwhelming a little bit to look at that table of contents.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to someone recently who said they were just going to read one story a day. So it was going to be a 78-day process. Oh. And, I like that rhythm.
Yes. Yeah. This should be marketed as like a wellness program.
Exactly.
All right. So let's turn back the clock here and I want to really focus in on you. And I mean, your whole life is built around helping other writers, editing other writers, building up other writers. And you're sort of always in the background in that relationship. I want to kind of talk about you and put you front and center here and your methods and your career. In 2003, you got the job, and the LA Times wrote a little piece about it. And this was the first line of the LA Times piece. A little-known 32-year-old UC Berkeley graduate has been named fiction editor of The New Yorker. So
I don't think I ever saw that. That's funny.
Humbling lead.
I had been here for 6 years before that, or 5 years before that, as deputy fiction editor. So
okay, well, we won't debate.
And the editors are little known.
Yeah, it's true. Well, not now, but I mean, certainly back then, like a little-known 32-year-old UC Berkeley graduate. Let's just not interrogate that characterization, but let's just think about David Remnick at that time picks you, and what do you think he saw in you? What do you think he must have talked to you and said, hey, I think you're the person to, steer the ship here. I think you're the person who can bring the New Yorker's vision to the world or to more people. Or what was it that you think that he saw in you then?
Well, you'd have to ask him, but I had been here for 5 years in the deputy position. And had worked really closely with Bill Buford, who was the previous fiction editor. And so he knew I could do this. He knew I was already part of it, and I was already working with so many writers. And it almost would have been weird to bring someone else in at that point, I think. So I don't know if I can take great credit for it, but I've been told I'm a reassuring, calm presence in the office. Not that I don't have freakouts or tantrums. So that's always good in an office mate.
And I think it's probably essential in dealing with the massive personalities that you would have to deal with in this job. But let's talk about your editorial philosophy. It's something I'm really interested in. I was reading once about Maxwell Perkins, and I couldn't find this quote online, but I believe he said something like, this is the editor of Fitzgerald and Hemingway and others, and he said, "My job is to bring the latent energy within a piece of fiction to the surface." So that's kind of a way that he described an aspect of what he does as an editor. I'm going to read you a couple quotes that I've heard from you over time. "My job is to see what the story is and to see what elements are not quite yet coming through," which is sort of a similar sentiment. "And my job is to read the writer's intention and make sure the story lives up to that intention." So, but I guess I just want to say, if there's a way to be concise about it, what do you see as your role?
I suppose there are a few roles. I mean, if you in some ways, you're both working with fiction, at least. Well, first, let me backtrack.
Yeah.
Writing fiction is a very strange profession because it's so personal. And because a writer sending a story or showing a story to readers is showing something of herself or himself and revealing something about the characters that the writers dreamed up, revealing something of their knowledge. It's sharing knowledge, it's sharing understanding, and sharing language. So it's very personal. It's not like, someone has, actually carpenters will come after me for this, but I was going to say, it's not like someone has built a table and put it up for sale. It's they've taken a little piece of their soul and put it on the page. So if you take that little piece of someone's soul and rip it apart and insult it, it's not going to be a nice day for that writer. Again, I agree with Maxwell Perkins that the idea is to find that soul, and if it's been buried under other things, to bring it to the surface and really to understand the voice of the story and then speak it, make sure it's speaking, which sounds kind of esoteric, but it's much more concrete when you're actually in the middle of a sentence.
People talk about a talent for writing. That's always, talent is a big question that comes up in the arts. What about a talent for editing? Is that a thing that you think exists, that you have, that you see that other people have, that is a specific, unique talent unto itself?
I think it is. I think it's a little bit like being a ventriloquist, you need to be able to assume many voices. It's why I people ask me often if I write fiction, and I don't, because I feel when you write fiction, you have to really be committed to what you're doing in your own particular way, and I have to be open to any way and try to understand it. So I guess the talent is this kind of ability to inhabit other people's voices.
Yeah, I read that book by Rick Rubin. I think it's called The Creative Act. But he produced the Beastie Boys, and he's produced kind of heavy metal. I mean, he's done kind of everything. And I thought of him a lot when I was thinking about this interview, because he really talks about how one of the skills that he thinks he has, which is so important, is this kind of like his own kind of malleability, invisibility, willingness to kind of disappear into what the idea is that's trying to come forth.
Yeah, And you have to be somewhat egoless. It isn't about you. It's about the story you're working on or the piece you're working on. It's not even really about the writer. It is about the story.
Do you ever use that actually in a kind of, I wanted to talk to you later about how to deal with like a difficult writer or a writer who doesn't want to be edited or doesn't agree with an edit. Do you ever use that as an appeal? I mean, you're like, hey, it's actually not about me. And it's also not about you. It's about, we're trying to do this third thing, you know?
No, because, stories are to their writers what they are to their writers. But I have had people say that when we work on a story together, it's like we're birthing this child, that there is that sense that this is a separate being.
Got it. Okay. So I was listening to an interview that you did with George Saunders. And at one point, George Saunders said, I have internalized Deborah. And because he's like, I don't want to disappoint her. And I want her to love it, the first time I send it over. Anyway, so I was trying to imagine, like, what is that like for George Saunders, like to have you internalized? And I'm just wondering, like, is there a kind of classic Deborah Treisman edit? Like there's like a particular thing that say you think the long dash is always overused, or you know what I mean? Or there's just something, I mean, that's very petty, but like you're always kind of like focusing on character over story or what have you, right? I'm just wondering, like, what I'm really getting at is, like, can you classify yourself in some way as an editor, like who's different than other editors? And like, this is a Deborah Treisman type of edit.
Yeah, I really hope not, because I hope that the edit is different on each piece and with each voice. Again, I feel like I have to be responsive to what I'm working on rather than making it responsive to me. So I mean, maybe there are things that I notice that are particular to me. I don't know. I did a eons ago, soon after college, I translated a book of criticism about Kafka, actually, by a French academic. And when I gave him the translation, he said, "I see you tend toward economy."
And that was what I'm talking about.
In translating, I had somehow rid it of the repetitions and the, the long-winded moments of saying the same thing again. And so maybe that's, that is something that might be distinctive about me. I tend toward economy.
That is so. All right. So let's see where the rubber hits the road here. So I was trying to think like, who's the most maximalist, effusive writer that I can think of that you edited? And so let's think of David Foster Wallace. Like, so how does your penchant towards maybe being economical and kind of scaling things back work when you're dealing with somebody who sort of doesn't know kind of where to stop and it's just so overflowing?
I agree that it's overflowing, but it's also with David Foster Wallace, everything was so precise, and he had thought about every word and every punctuation mark. So it was difficult for him to adjust anything, even you would bring something up and he would say, that's wrong on purpose for this reason. And so it's not to say that he didn't take edits. It was always a long discussion for quite small things. And sometimes I would just point to a sentence or a paragraph where I thought it wasn't quite landing and maybe make a suggestion. He would do it completely differently. Or he would say, I took this change, but that meant I had to change these 15 other things.
Thanks a lot, Deborah.
No, I mean, he was actually very responsive. Like he did want his pieces to be as good as they could be. And he wasn't, I don't think I ever did anything that offended him. And that's another part of the process. It's never this draconian, you have to make this change or else I'm not publishing this. That's not what it's like. It's I find generally writers are grateful to be told if something's not quite working.
Mm-hmm.
And you build up this relationship of trust where they believe you if you say that. I just feel like the editor is often, after a spouse or sister or mom is the first reader, and no one wants a story to go out in a flawed way. So if you're telling them there's a flaw on this page, they want to fix it. So, so going back to David Foster Wallace, yeah, he wanted to fix things.
Yeah.
But he had thought about every word.
Yeah. Can you talk about how important trust is? I have found in my career, both as an editor and a writer, that trust is just the most essential thing. And I feel like sometimes as a writer, there have been occasions, certainly for myself, where it's almost a blind trust. And you think, you know what? I have an instinct about this, but I really want to meditate on it. And I'm going to meditate on it because of my trust and admiration for this person. So I guess my question to you is just talk about how trust plays a role and how you establish that trust.
Well, first, I don't want anyone to have blind trust in me because I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. And, we have a fiction department. It is definitely not just me. Cressida Leishan and Willing Davidson have been editing fiction alongside me for decades. And I will often, if I don't quite see something in a story, their opinions, if they contradict mine, mean a lot to me. And I will listen to that. So I don't think anyone should trust anyone entirely, because sometimes there are just voices that one reader doesn't really hear.
Yeah.
And I found that working with writers, if you suggest something and they really adamantly feel it's wrong, they have to trust you to say, okay.
Yeah.
Leave it as it is, right?
Yep.
So there's always a give and take. And I think obviously the longer you work with someone, the more that trust builds up. But I've found people to be quite trusting right from the get-go.
Yeah. Looking back at your career, did you have a mentor as an editor, or a series of mentors? And if so, was there one that you could particularly point to, or a piece of editing advice that has served you over the years?
That's a good question. I think initially, no. I was kind of making it up as I went along. But I would say, like, if I had to say it, my mentor was reading. I always read so much, and I had so many voices in my head, and I had a feeling for sentences and how they worked. And if I had not been constantly reading, and this is why, I hate to say it, but looking at young people who are spending those 5 hours a day on their phones scrolling instead of reading, I don't know who's going to have it in future generations. But before working at the New Yorker, I worked for 4 years as the managing editor of a quarterly called Grand Street, a literary and art quarterly, and it was owned by a woman called Jean Stein, who came from a sort of Hollywood royalty. Her father was Jules Stein, who had founded MCA and Universal. And she was, she was difficult to work for sometimes because, for many reasons, but she was brilliant. And I did learn some editing things from her, for sure. She had done an oral history of Edie Sedgwick. She was just this incredible interviewer. And she was an incredible interviewer because she knew to really act as though she knew nothing while interviewing, and people would then explain. And so she got so much information from them. And so that's not quite editing. That's more like eliciting, but then she was quite dramatic in editing. So I feel like I learned a lot from her.
You were once asked what makes a great writer, and you said obsessiveness and dedication certainly help. I mean, I feel like you're someone who, there's hardly an author who's well known in literary fiction who you haven't worked with. And I guess just trying to kind of aggregate all that experience of working with all of these authors, like, does that comment still stand? I just kind of want to ask you that question again, sort of like, what do the great writers have in common that you see?
Yeah, obsessiveness and dedication. Perceptiveness, obviously. They're observers, good observers. And they also have little voices in their head that say strange things, often. And probably it takes some confidence, right? You have to have a conviction that you have something to say. You have to have a conviction that you can say it. Yeah. If you don't have that, you probably give up, right?
Yeah. I want to talk about
life.
Wait, what did you? I talked over you. What did you say?
I said it's not a fun life.
It's not a fun life. Oh no!
If you have a choice, if you don't feel you have to write,
you
shouldn't.
Yeah,
because it's hard.
It's really hard. I want to talk about writer confidence for a moment and how it relates to being edited. In my opinion, it takes a great deal of confidence to be willing to be edited. But I want to put this question to you. Do you see a connection between the willingness to be edited and the, lack of a better word, the greatness of the writer? And there's kind of, if somebody is less willing to be edited, that can be a sign of insecurity, or at least it's kind of something that might stop them on the way to being edited, to being great. I'm just trying to connect willingness to be edited with success.
Yeah, I mean, there are some cases where someone is unwilling to be edited simply because they're not used to it. British writers are not edited the way American writers are. Then they're not used to it.
How does that work?
And there can be, they're just like, there isn't very much hands-on editing with fiction in Britain. There's some, there are people who do it, but so, sometimes British writers have been caught off guard. It happened to me with Martin Amis.
Oh, really?
I sent him a proof on a story, which was really quite mild, not heavy-handed, and he called me and he said, what I sent you was not a draft. It was a finished story. And I said, oh, okay, Martin, I see, like, some of these things you think are unnecessary, but maybe we could just go through it, and maybe there's one note or two that might be helpful. And then, took maybe half of it. But so it wasn't that, it was just sort of shock at seeing writing on his story, which he thought was complete. And so you do get, I think that response was not one of insecurity. But in general, I've found that, the more experienced a writer is, the more open to editing, because that writer knows that they can say no if they don't agree, and because they've been helped in the past by editing, and it's allowed them to see new ways of doing something that maybe even they weren't quite happy with as it was. And it does happen that writers earlier in their career do have that insecurity where they feel they've built this kind of precarious house of cards, and if you take one card out, the whole thing will fall. But I have not encountered very much resistance. And maybe it has to do with the fact that I'm not, telling people to change what they've done in any substantial way. If I don't think the substance of a story is working or promising, I'm not going to try to edit it or suggest a revision on it.
You said something really interesting once. It was that you sometimes will reject a work from a big name, brand name author because you feel like they have sort of worked on it too much, and it's sort of become too precious to them. It's become too ripe, and you feel like there's sort of not a place for you, and any edits you have may be refused. I just thought that was sort of an interesting thing, that like an author's relationship to something can be a cause for, like you're just saying, like, yeah.
Did I put it that way?
I am paraphrasing. Go ahead and correct it.
I don't think I've ever turned anything down because I thought there was no place for me to edit.
Okay.
I think, you know, if you work with a brilliant writer and you publish that person's best stories, and then you get a story that's kind of B-list for them, that's maybe just doesn't quite have, and often they know it, doesn't quite have what the other stories have, what their best stories have. You know, I was going to say my feeling, but it's also a general feeling, and it's a long practice at the magazine. Roger Angell definitely felt this way. Our feeling is that you're not doing that writer any favors. Even if their second best work is better than somebody else's best. You're not doing them a favor by putting out in the world their second best. So, you know, if we hit that, then we might say, you know, there's room to improve this one, or maybe you want to rethink it in this way, and so on. And often they do.
Okay. On the positive side, can you think of a time that you received a work of fiction that it was just the first read just absolutely like blew your socks off, and you were like white knuckling it, like, oh my God, what is this? It was so good. Is there a way do you feel comfortable singling out somebody for praise in that way?
I mean, it's happened many times.
Yeah.
There's rarely been a story that didn't need anything at all.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, there are just the stories where they hook you from the beginning.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about The New Yorker, because this, you know, The New Yorker is, as I said, the Saturday Night Live of fiction. It's one of the biggest and greatest and longest standing American cultural institutions. And certainly any fiction writer in America, it's sort of a rite of passage that you at one point send something to The New Yorker and you get it rejected, which happens to about 99.9% of us. And I found out when researching this interview, also happened to you when you were 11 years old. Is that true, that you sent a story in at 11?
Yeah, I should never have fessed up to that.
Do you remember what the story is about, or should we just move on?
I have some vague memory of like a river and a hammock. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I thought it was like sort of a great story of like your great revenge arc. Like they rejected you and then you took over the mothership. So one thing that is sort of like a phrase that you hear in the culture of writing is like the New Yorker short story, like kind of what is the New Yorker short story? And there was this amazing quote from James Thurber that you put in your introduction about like what he was seeing back in 1938. I just love this so much. This is what James Thurber said was the New Yorker story of that time. We've had an awful lot of sad, drifting little men muddling gently through the most trivial and impalpable of situations, ending up on a faint and, to me, usually evasive note of resignation to it all, whatever it is. That just cracked me up so much. And I think there is still occasionally some things like that, you know, and but you talk about kind of how it changes over time. You said, you know, in the 40s, there was a kind of moral intensity, maybe kind of partly in reaction to the war. In the 60s and 70s, the stories were more messy, as you say. And I know it's kind of hard to see the forest for the trees here, but like, is there anything that you can say about kind of what you think the short story is now for the New Yorker? Is there something definable about it?
Yeah, this is why I didn't say that in my introduction, because it is really hard to see that. There's so many ways of approaching the short story.
Yeah.
And we try to publish all of them, all of the ones that work.
Yeah.
So I guess it's just, it's now such an area of opportunity. There's nothing that doesn't fly. I mean, if someone wrote, Be a Good Boy 50 times, we probably wouldn't publish that. But there aren't a lot of limits on what you can do, so long as you're writing something that people want to read and that says something and does something to the reader.
Yeah. Quick segue. Again, bring up George Saunders because he's somebody you published a lot, and he was great when he was on my show. And when he was on my show, he was talking about a swim in a pond in the rain. And I asked him, I said, George, short story writing in the late 1800s in Russia was so great. What do you think the status is of the American short story, or just the short story today in American culture? And he said, and I give him credit for being blunt, he said the short story is in a state of degradation. Those were his words. And I just wanted to ask you what you thought. I mean, kind of like, where do you see the short story fitting into our culture today?
Well, first of all, why did George say that?
Well, I mean, I think it was in the context of talking about Chekhov and,
right.
All the great Russians, and it was sort of relative to that. I want to say is probably kind of where that comment came from.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there were there was more structure and more strictness about form in those stories, and so now you can sort of sprawl. And the risk is that with no rules to break, what are you doing, right? Mm-hmm. You can't, if you break all the rules, then it's not really a readable thing. So perhaps he's seeing too much freedom in stories. But, people are constantly saying it's the death of the short story. People only buy novels and so on. Yeah. If anything, our whole online world has made people much more inclined to read short pieces than long ones. They don't have the attention span for novels anymore. I'm sorry, Mark. I know you're writing one. So I think there's always going to be a readership for something that you can pick up and read in one sitting.
And speaking of which, I mean, Cat Person was an example of something that just went wild. I think that was in 2017 that came out. Can you tell me about, like, I'm kind of curious, how did that surprise you that story just kind of took over the world, it seemed, for about a month?
Yeah, I think it surprised everyone. I mean, It's a really good story and it really captured something. But part of that, the Cat Person madness was there was a whole faction of readers who thought it was a memoir, even though it was written in the third person, with fiction at the top, and who took it personally somehow. There was the woman in it remarks on the kind of big belly of the man, and so we had like offended men standing up for their right to have big bellies, and we had there was all the people invested it with so much personal response. It wasn't like reading a story. It was like everyone was feeling they were reading about themselves, and that's sort of amazing. Yeah, I mean, what a feat, right? And I had that same response to it, which was it made me really uncomfortable to read it, and I felt like I was in the room. And I felt like I'd been in that room, although I had not been in that room, not that one specifically, and not in that situation specifically. But if you can do that to your reader, you're doing something right. And people responded, I think, because it made a lot of people uncomfortable.
Yeah. Even just thinking of it now, I just feel like kind of peeling something off my skin or something.
Well, and it came out like it sort of got mixed up in the Me Too movement, which happened to come out, a couple months after or a few weeks after our Harvey Weinstein piece, by Ronan Farrow. And it So somehow it was interpreted as being a Me Too story, when in fact it had nothing to do with, someone in a position of power over anyone else. It had it had to do with a really bad date, and it had, if anything, it had to do with this kind of false sense of becoming intimate and really knowing someone through texts, and then facing the reality of the physical person. And so it wasn't about Me Too, but people kind of lumped it in with that, and it seemed to speak to them of the only small level of overlap was the fact that it involved sex that began in a consensual way and then felt wrong to the woman, who could have probably extracted herself in the story, but didn't, because it was too much work to do. And so that was a situation many people have been in, I think. And so it felt on borderline. It had something to do with consent, but it really wasn't. It wasn't a statement story. And in fact, it had been written. It had sat, I'm sorry, Kristen Rapenian, it had sat in my inbox for at least 6 months before that. So
wow. So there's hope. There's hope for all of us. So let's actually get into that. And I just want to run through just a couple of mechanics of how stories get into the New Yorker, because I think it's fascinating for people. Yeah. So first of all, how many submissions do you think you get per year?
Per year is really hard to say. I mean, I think we probably get, to fiction department members, we probably get about somewhere between 100 and 200 a week. To the unsolicited, fiction at newyorker.com, probably the same amount or more. So figure a few hundred a week.
A few hundred a week. Okay. So, I think I'm doing the math right when I'm thinking that's maybe 10 or 20,000, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 submissions per year, perhaps.
I mean, I don't sit and count.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And I don't see my colleagues' inboxes, but it's a lot.
Right. And just another question is about kind of the slush pile. And I'm not critiquing the merits of the story you submitted when you were 11. I have my New Yorker rejection when I was 17. It was a poetry rejection. But who is fielding the 17-year-old Mark Cecil, 11-year-old Deborah Treisman submission? Is that an intern level person or what?
We have several fiction readers who work 1 day a week and just read those manuscripts. And if there's anything at all promising, they pass it along to one of the editors.
Got it.
Sometimes they're MFA students, sometimes they're older, doing other part-time jobs. They're all really smart readers.
Okay. Talk to me about what, I know this is just, I feel like you've sort of already answered this question, but I'm just going to ask it again. But what are you looking for? What is the thing that is going to when it, let's say of the 10,000 a year, 200 make it really into serious consideration, and then 50 end up in the magazine, whatever. To get down to that final level, can you kind of qualify what is it that they have, the special thing?
No. When you see it, you know when you read it, and we don't always agree on every story. That's why I basically, stories are sent to me. They're sent to Cressida Leishan, the deputy fiction editor. They're sent to Willing Davidson, who's a senior editor, and they're sent to Dennis Shue, who's an assistant fiction editor. So we read our own submissions, and then if there's something we want to take seriously, even if we think it probably won't end up in the magazine, we share that. And then once a week we sit down and talk about whatever stories have circulated that week. And sometimes it's 2 and 2, 2 pro, 2 against. Sometimes
how do you break the tie?
I mean, I get to be the tiebreaker if I want to be, but I also will, if say I'm pro and 2 people are strongly against, I will think about that. It's about listening. It's about discussing, and sometimes I'm a little anti something, and and someone else will see greatness in it.
Mm.
And so there's a lot of flexibility in those discussions and openness, and that's probably, I have this conversation when we do look for fiction readers, because we'll ask prospective people to read stories blind, with no names on them, and write opinions of them. And I find that they're very often feel that it's their job to find fault and to say, well, this is, this isn't working, this is wrong. And really, it's their job to see what's good, because, every really good story has some things wrong, almost every, as we've said, and you have to be an open reader. And that doesn't mean that you pass along, 90% of what you read in the slush pile. It just means you have to have the ability to see if something actually has that originality or that insight.
Given the amount of submissions that you go through, is there any thing you could say about the trends that you're seeing? I'm just kind of curious. Like, sometimes I talk to my agent about this thing, like, what are you seeing a lot of? Is there a certain kind of over indexing towards stories about XYZ or stories in the style of ABC?
There have been times in the past where I felt like we were getting a lot of something similar. And sometimes you get stories that respond to external events. So you might get a lot of stories dealing with Gaza, or a lot of stories in which Trump figures in some way. There was a period where I got a lot of stories with creepy clowns.
Okay.
But I don't ultimately, like, those aren't trends. Those are coincidences, or those are, people living in the modern world. And we get a lot of stories with COVID right now.
Okay.
But stylistically, I don't see any strong trend. I see a lot of really different writers. I feel like we've gotten out of the days when you talked about things as workshop stories, that they all sounded the same. Like that at least we've moved on from, I think.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Another kind of part of your job that I think must be extraordinarily difficult is the amount of rejection that you must. Like, in my own tiny world, where I am like getting people who pitch themselves to me for my show, I find it difficult to reject even that small amount of people relative to what you're doing. The chances of getting in the New Yorker is so slim. I'm just curious, like, for any either A, techniques of like kind of softening the blow, or B, any kind of like philosophy that you have about turning away authors. You mentioned something before about how sometimes you're not doing a favor to an author by publishing their B work. So that's like an example of that. But just talk to me about kind of what you've learned about rejection, how you handle being that person, which must be a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, it's hard. I do remind myself that a lot of people send stories in like they're buying a lottery ticket, right? They're not actually expecting to succeed.
Right.
But it's particularly hard to reject stories by writers that you work with and have a relationship with. And just in general, I try to make it clear, and it's often true, that because a story isn't right for this particular magazine and this audience does not mean it doesn't have something, does not mean it wouldn't be published somewhere else, right? I don't know. I guess those are my best tips. If a story is really not working, don't offer up advice, because the writer will change that thing, send it right back. I've learned that the hard way. If you think it could work with some revision, then sure, I'll offer up advice. But if you really don't think it's working, don't pinpoint why.
That is good advice. Good advice. All right. So I have a few more questions, and then we'll take a few from the audience here. But so I want to talk about sort of like, this is a little bit of a charged issue, but it's going to talk about a kind of political issue now and how that intersects with the New Yorker. So I think, needless to say, institutions of all kinds across the United States, certainly for the last decade or so, have been dealing with questions of identity, representation, systemic bias. Especially art and cultural institutions have been wondering, like, about who gets to be in the thing based on their gender, race, and so on. I know that, I've seen that you said that in your tenure, for example, there's more women who are published, more international writers who are published. And I thought it was really interesting a moment ago when you said, sometimes you have people read with no name on the top. They're just reading the fiction. And so that kind of shields the identity issue a bit. But I'm just wondering, like, in the New Yorker, I'd have to believe that, like, this issue is talked about and kind of what the fiction department's role is or your attitude toward it. So I just want to give that question to you in an open-ended way, like, sort of, how does the New Yorker think about these kind of really white-hot issues about who ought to be in there telling the stories, who ought to have access to your platform based on identity?
And you're talking about fiction.
Fiction, yes, yeah.
Specifically.
Yeah.
It's not something we talk about.
Okay.
Because really we're talking about stories. I love it when we have a story that's great that shows us another world or another way of life or that teaches something. We have done a fair amount of translation or stories from other countries. But I cannot think of a time in 27 years when the race or ethnicity or identity of a writer has made us either take a story or reject a story. Mm-hmm. It's not part of the decision making. Mm. So what's been wonderful to see is how many writers of color and how many writers with different ethnic identities are being published, are writing, amazing work and are sending it here. Mm-hmm. So that has been a rewarding shift in the culture.
And just more broadly, I'm just wondering, like, what do you think about, and I know this is sort of a tricky thing, but I just want to try this question, okay? I mean, what do you think broadly about this identity question? Because even if you don't talk about it to New Yorker, it's like, it's so pervasive in our culture. It's so everywhere. This question of, who should be able to tell what stories and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering if you personally kind of have a thought about kind of on the one end, art just sort of existing in a vacuum and it's just about the story versus, hey, like, let's prioritize who is telling the story. Do you think that's like a helpful conversation for our culture to be having?
It's a problem if someone is telling a story that person doesn't know how to tell. Mm. But if that's the case, then it may not be a fantastic writer, because it is the writer's work to imagine another life and to fully imagine and inhabit the stories that they write. So, I mean, we certainly wouldn't take any story in which someone was writing about a person with a different identity and completely missed the mark or seemed to write about it in a way that was derogatory or offensive in any way. That has no place here. Mm-hmm. But again, it's just we don't have quotas. We have a desire for really good work and to really encourage anyone from anywhere who's anyone to, produce it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. And I appreciate you answering that question. I know these things are tricky for everybody right now. All right, so let's go to some audience questions. So this is a question from Grant Catton, who's an artist that I know, and he actually has a website where he has reviewed over 300 New Yorker stories. And he says, in reading all of those stories, and this is all in your tenure, this is like the last kind of 10 years or so, he says, one thing I've noticed in these stories is there is often a single sentence in the story in which the author gives you the keys to understanding the meaning of the piece. Does that resonate with you?
I find that kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
There's never a sentence planted in a story for that purpose, but perhaps there's often a moment in which the writer unwittingly, or wittingly, I suppose, says something that is at the heart of the story. I don't know. Can you think of an example, Grant? Can you type in an example in the comment box?
Oh, that's great. All right, Grant. So if you're still on, Grant, then just type it in the box, and we'll try to circle back to that. Okay. Let's see. I have. Okay, here's this is sort of a funny question from Jeremy. Hi, Deborah. One question. Do you, like me and everyone else, also have a stack of New Yorkers in your house that you refuse to throw away?
I don't bring them home. They're in my office.
But they're stacked up there?
So often I'm reading what's in them before they come out. So
yeah.
They're in my computer, really.
Oh my gosh. I feel like it's like a secular sin to throw away a New Yorker. My method is actually I save them up in a stack, and then anytime I go on a flight, I take like 7 of them, and then I just plow through them on my flight.
I mean, I find it really heartening that you and the person who asked the question are reading them in print.
Yes.
So.
Oh yes. I love reading them in print. It takes me back. All right. Let's see. We had another question in here. Okay. Do you respond to all the people that send submissions? Thank you, Renee.
I respond, or someone else in the department responds to everything that's sent to me, I hope. The unsolicited submissions do get a response. It might be a form response, or it might be a more personal one. But so, yes, I think we do.
Okay.
That's the idea.
Great. Well, I when I got my poetry rejection when I was 17, I taped it to the door of my dorm room. I was so proud of this New Yorker. It was mailed to me in a piece of paper. Anyway, all right, Deborah, I am going to wrap here. We have come to the end of the hour. This has been so great. I appreciate your candor about these things. I appreciate you coming on the show for sure. One final question for you from me, which is this. One day, hopefully far off, there will be another editor of fiction for the New Yorker, and you will have moved on to brighter horizons. Imagine that there is some kind of awards dinner or recognition of your time, and the person is up there and they say, I want to thank Deborah Treisman and recognize her for the following things. My question to you is what's the thing you're most proud of? That you would love to have people look back and say, you know what, she did this in her time.
Gosh, I'd love someone else to just say it. I guess just, a sensitivity to language and writing and skill at making it, at improving it or making it what it can be.
Yeah.
So that would be what I would hope someone would credit me with.
I love it. All right, Deborah, we're going to end there. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but this has been a wonderful hour. Deborah, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work you do. Thank you for being such a kind and gracious soul. I have such faith in this institution that you're the head of. And I just feel like we need more kind people out there in this world. It's hard out there for writers. So thank you for everything you do.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you next time on Thoughtful Bro, everybody.